Good afternoon. From 2004 to 2011, the Canadian International Development Agency funded an HIV surveillance project which collected biological and behavioral data among sex workers and people who inject drugs in nearly 20 cities across Pakistan. Today, I'm going to present some preliminary results from an analysis of HIV clusters that were identified in the 2011 samples. So in 2011, we had more than 16,000 people who inject drugs, Hijra, male and female sex workers participate in the study. For those of you who are not familiar with the term Hijra, I'll explain it briefly. Hijras are a distinct sociocultural group in South Asia, and they're considered a third gender. Their traditional social role is around performing blessings for weddings, for births, for the opening of shops. Today, Hijras often beg and exchange sex for money and goods. So in this 2011 round, among our entire sample, the HIV prevalence was about 10%. And it varied considerably depending on the key population group. So it was 27% among people who inject drugs, 5% among Hijra sex workers, 1.6% among male sex workers, and less than 1% among female sex workers. So we took a look at this positivity rate by city, and we found quite a geographic heterogeneity. So if you look at the blue bars, for example, that shows the HIV prevalence among people who inject drugs in our study. And we found that, for example, in Quetta, about 7% were infected, and in Faisalabad, 52% were infected. So this really led us to look into the possibility of unique sub-epidemics that are distributed across Pakistan that may be characterized by unique risk contexts, behaviors, sexual and syringe sharing networks, and unique epidemic trajectories as well. So to begin to look at this, we took the positive samples and we sequenced the GP41 gene. We aligned that, we built trees, and then we took a look at clusters of sequences that were at least 99% similar, and interpreted those as really the discrete sub-epidemics that we wanted to take a look at a little bit further. So overall, 57% of our sequences were clustered with at least one other sequence. The clusters ranged in size from just 2 to 96 unique, or 96 individuals, or 96 sequences. In this table here, a cluster size of 1 indicates unclustered, basically. That's just one unique sequence. From this table, you can see that people who inject drugs are really more likely to be in large clusters compared to other groups. And in fact, compared to male sex workers, they had twice the odds of being clustered. Clusters, for the most part, were composed entirely of people who inject drugs and associated with only one city. And then we did have a few clusters, larger clusters, that included the other subpopulations and were distributed across different cities. So taking a look at cluster size by city, we do see differences. Circled by red are some of the cities that tended to have larger cluster sizes. And then more towards the left are a lot of cities that had a lot of unclustered individuals, actually. So this is interesting and has some programmatic implications in terms of what type of data you use to inform your programs. For example, Peshawar, in the sort of towards the right in the middle, had a large degree of large clustering. However, the prevalence there was only about 20%, which is kind of mid-range. And if you compare that to Karachi, Karachi had a lot of unclustered individuals, but the HIV prevalence there is quite a bit larger at 42%. So it's really important what kind of evidence you consider when trying to inform your programs. Because if you interpret clusters as an indication of of ongoing transmission, then you may consider it more important to focus on cities that have larger clusters as opposed to cities that are largely unclustered. So based on these very preliminary results, HIV prevention interventions might be best focused towards people who inject drugs, and in particular cities that have larger clusters, such as Peshawar and Gujarat. Also, if there's an interest in trying to prevent the increasing prevalence of HIV among sex workers in Pakistan, we've seen it go from very, very low prevalence to up into the 5%. Then it would be useful to take a look at those clusters that include sex workers as well as people who inject drugs, and understand the characteristics of those clusters, and use that to inform program planning. So this preliminary analysis really generated a whole lot of questions. A lot of questions about the determinants of large cluster sizes. Questions also about how this relates to transmission networks, whether this is an indication of transmission networks, and we have sort of interpreted it that way. In 2014, we collected more data among people who inject drugs that incorporated a network component. So what we'll be able to do going forward is compare network data to this kind of molecular data and see whether the molecular data and the network data produce similar results and would inform programs in a similar way. So I'd just like to acknowledge the HASP study team, Pakistan's national and provincial HIV prevention programs, the local service delivery programs, and the participants in the study. Thank you.